Greetings. I'm Trygve Olsen, President of Viking Strategies and Senior Advisor to the Lincoln Project. I put this PowerPoint together as almost a class called Faith or Fear about some of the challenges that we face today in the United States as it relates to the battle between democracy and autocracy. I'll get into my background to talk about this in a little bit. But before I do, I want to start with a few things that sort of give you a background about what this presentation is about. And I want to say thank you at the outset for taking the time to listen. And on YouTube, you can actually click on links to specific parts if you want to go back to see them. So let's get on with the presentation. First thing you have to understand is that democracy requires faith in one another, whereas autocracy is opposed through fear of one another. And really one of the best examples of that in the world today is what you're seeing in Ukraine with the way that President Zelensky has rallied together his people, and the Ukrainian people have come together through faith in each other across party lines, across various divides, whether they be demographic, ethnic, to stand together in defense of their country. And having faith in one another, whereas Vladimir Putin is basically saying to the Ukrainians, you subject yourself to my rule and my will, or I will kill you, I will destroy your country. And that really gets to the heart of the battle between democracy, which requires, as I said, faith in each other, and autocracy, which is imposed really through fear of one another. The next thing that you really have to understand about this battle is that holding power, even in a democracy, tends to be a zero-sum game. In other words, when we have elections, one side wins, the other side loses. There's only one president of the United States, and he runs the executive branch, and there are other power centers within. The actual electoral power is vested in each of the branches, and you either have that or you don't. The genius really of our founding fathers was that they created democracy. And this is true of all democracies around the world, and I'll get into some of the experiences I've had working in places around the world. But democracy wraps that zero sum of who holds power inside a win-win system of, what we call checks and balances, regular elections, rule of law, the various institutions, civilian control of the military. Those are all win-wins, places where overlapping interests occur. And, it's transformational when the founding fathers did this, because typically who held power was bestowed by those who had power. King died and their son became the new monarch. And what our founding fathers were doing, and what democracy is all about, is those institutions, democratic institutions, the rule of law, and all those pieces working together to ensure that there's a win-win system, that even if you don't have power now, there's always the potential for you to have power in the future, and that creates ultimately acceptance by those who don't have power of the legitimacy of the power that others have. Here in the United States today, and one of the reasons why I put this presentation together, because I've seen this in other places, is this evolution that's occurring within our body politic, within the demos, as the founders might have put it, where we're characterizing now those on the other side as enemies. And CBS YouGov has done some great research on this, asking in a survey, do you see the other side as enemies, or do you see them as political opponents? And after the 2016 elections, which were contentious elections between Hillary Clinton, and her supporters, and Donald Trump and his supporters, and there's kind of a surprise outcome, you only had 22% of Americans who said the other side was enemies. And we saw that number during the course of the Trump administration and the Trump years grow somewhat to 34% on election day in 2020. But where we really hit a problematic patch is in that post-election day environment, and in particular, the allegations of the big lie that the election was fraudulent, moving all the way through events of January 6th, which became the impetus for me putting this presentation together, where we went from 34% to 49% of Americans saying the other side was enemies. And that growth, as you can see in the two graphs on the right, that particular growth, each of the rings represents, the inside ring would be, 2016, 2020, 21. That growth really between election day and January 6th was Republicans moving towards saying Democrats were the enemies, were enemies, not political opponents. In fact, it was 57% of Republicans would have described Democrats as enemies in the post-1-6 era, and 44% of Democrats. It really was, that growth was on on the Republican side. What we've seen in the last year, though, and this is not odd, is a growth on the Democrat side, where we now have an environment where 58% of Democrats, 56% of Republicans say the other side is enemies, not political opponents. And that's a natural outgrowth. And so, when you have a nation where one side sees the other as enemies, where both sides see each other as enemies, you're going to have this inevitable process. They're going to fear each other. You fear your enemies' motives, what they're trying to do. That's not the case with political opponents. And it gets to the next aspect of this, which is we essentially have two games. We have the game we know, which is one of faith in each other, and we have the game we're in, which is the one of fear of each other. And that game we know is the one that's traditionally been win-win. The game that we're in is one where you have actors who see the other side as enemies, and it's a zero-sum game. You don't give power to your enemies. Your enemies are seeking to impose their will on you. And so, the game we know is one about political opponents to defeat in an election, knowing that there's going to be more elections. Whereas the game we're in is one of enemies who are to be destroyed. And if they hold power, typically that's viewed as illegitimately holding power. And really the danger arises from this, and this is why it's not unnormal what we're seeing. The illiberal zero sum of one side becomes justification for extremism on the other. And I'm going to talk a lot about illiberalism and the justifications and what extremism is about, and radicalization of violence. But before I do that, I want to touch just briefly on my background and why I'm maybe uniquely qualified to talk about some of these things and help teach you and understand them better. My professional journey over the past 3 decades has really been comprised of 2 roads, one often traveled and one less traveled. The often traveled journey started in my native state of Wisconsin, helping run campaigns in and around the world of Governor Tommy Thompson for state office, local office. And along the way, I ended up getting a chance to work on multiple presidential campaigns, including some at senior levels. I did work for Senate Republicans, the Republican Party nationally, and I even got the opportunity to do work for people like Angela Merkel's CDU and the British Conservatives in Europe. And it really was an opportunity to, see firsthand electoral politics governing up close in functioning democracies. But really, that part of my professional journey isn't all that relevant. It's relevant to understanding, but it really isn't relevant or the genesis for faith or fear. That comes from the road less traveled. And that was nearly 3 years as a volunteer, as a consultant, as an employee of the International Republican Institute that was led by Senator John McCain at the time. We worked closely in a bipartisan way with the National Democratic Institute. I did work with those fighting for democracy in places ranging from Serbia to Venezuela to Burma to Belarus, Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians. If you were to think of a dictator, um, past or present in the last 30 years, there's a really good chance I trained the activists working to try and build democracy. I also worked in emerging democracies in Central and Eastern Europe as they were working to become democracies. And it's really that experience coupled with the road often traveled that I think gives me some unique insights for you about how democracy and autocracy and that battle that's going on here in the United States, that's going on in Europe, and quite frankly, that's going on in places like Ukraine, um, typically works and unfolds. Along the way, I was labeled an enemy of the Belarusian state by Alexander Lukashenko. I trained thousands of activists in over 40 countries on 5 continents. And perhaps the most important lesson that I learned from those experiences is that when we think about a democracy, and we look at any country really, in a democracy, it's almost a bell curve of what is the normal of political dialogue. And the normal in a democracy is built around consensus. Um, so the majority of things that you see that happen in terms of policy outcomes typically end up working their way through the partisan, because partisanship is a normal part of any democracy as well. And some democracies, are multi-party systems. Some like ours in America are two-party system. It doesn't really matter. That partisanship is normal competition, but it's competition to lead to that win-win of consensus on big issues to provide for people. The next sort of deviation out, it would be extremist. And when we think about extremism, we often think of it as being a negative. And that's particularly true in Europe. They talk about extremism. But in reality, in the United States, um, there have been things that have been seen as extremist, like the universal suffrage movement or the civil rights movement or, marriage equality, that work their way through the partisanship, where those grievances that certain Americans had became partisan issues, and then they worked their way to consensus. There were other things that were seen as extremism that the process just sort of discarded out. The next step after that would be things that are radicalization. We've had some instances of that, but that's very rare. And of course, violent. The Civil War is the great example, which happened once in the 240 years that America has existed, plus years. Um, so it's been really rare. The Civil War was a black swan that the issue of slavery led to, you know, instead of working its way through the partisanship, it flushed out of the system through radicalization and also violence. Um, and so when we are thinking about our politics in America, we typically think about it in terms of a pendulum swinging. That's what you learn in a college political science course between the partisan sides. But in every country where I've ever worked, it's also swinging between faith in each other and fear of one another. And right now, um, we've really entered a period where, um, fear is rising, and it's rising on those extremes, and faith is falling. And what we have to ask ourselves is what we're seeing, just the inevitable black swans that oftentimes occur. That idea, most swans are white, almost all swans are white. You see a black one, it's just an outlier. Or is it tipping points to some other kind of normal? And that can lead to critical mass where events start to take hold and eventually you have an entire system that implodes. And, you know, that is really where the focus needs to be. Where are those tipping points? Is what we're seeing black swans, or are they tipping points? And if they are tipping points, how do we keep that from growing into, from extremist to radicalized to violent? And really any discussion of that starts with us asking the question, what is driving fear in America? And that question we have to ask ourselves is, what's driving fear in America today? And the first thing that I'd like you to understand about fear in a political context is that it really is related to grievance. And grievances come in two types. There's grievances that are real. For example, African Americans concerned about how often members of their community are treated unfairly by the criminal justice system, simply pulled over and, when they're driving, to even being killed by people in the police. And so there's the grievances that are real, and then, grievances can also be contrived. Ones that are imagined grievances, or ones that are not founded in truth or facts. They just don't bear out. And obviously, the stolen election, the big lie, and what we saw in 1/6 was the result of a contrived grievance. And what is leading people to see the other side as enemies is in large part built upon some of those contrived grievances. So it begs the question, what is it that Americans fear? And I spent a number of years working with an organization called Lord Ashcroft Polls that does some of the best research around through their Ashcroft in America program and their work in the UK. But through Ashcroft in America, they looked at what are the things that Americans fear, and they asked people. They gave people a bunch of issues like the cost of healthcare, and they said from 0, you're not afraid at all, to 100, you're very afraid. What are those fears? And ultimately, the average score for most fears was only around 50. And the healthcare, cost of healthcare, violent crime, things like that, those aren't overwhelmingly, people aren't terrified around them. They aren't really the kind of thing around which grievances are built. But there were two subsets of Americans who had scores well into the 70s around certain issues. And those are the kinds of things that are grievances around which people can become extremist and potentially, under certain circumstances, radicalized and even become violent. And those two groups are African Americans, who score an average of 74, so almost 2/3 of the way to being terrified something happened. And those issues are being treated unfairly by the criminal justice system, or a member of their family or friends being killed by police. The others are people whose primary source of information is Fox News. And their fears that are well into the 70s are the U.S. becoming a socialist country, or immigration admitting terrorists into the United States. And the way that question was asked was actually legal immigration, illegal immigration. So sort of that idea of caravans crossing the border. Now, if you look at these grievances, there's massive documentation of the way that the criminal justice system sort of has two sets of standards when it comes to black people and white people in the United States. When you talk about illegal immigration admitting terrorists into people's community who may kill them, none of the major terrorist incidents that have occurred in the United States were with immigrants who came across our borders illegally. There's been a number of incidents, 9/11 being the most prominent. All of them came legally and overstayed their visas. So they may have been here illegally, but it isn't like they crossed into the country illegally. And so, and I can tell you, having worked in several European countries, are they more socially progressive than the United States? In some cases, and in some cases not. And so, both of those grievances on the Fox News side strike me as being built more around contrived. And the ones for African Americans tend to be ones that I personally would argue are much more along the lines of real grievances that need to work their way through that partisan process towards consensus if our democracy is working. Now, the next thing I want to give you some insights into is the psychology by which people become extremists. And there's really 4 psychological steps, and I'm just going to use the pandemic because it's something that, all of us experienced as an example of on a psychological level. And this is based off a lot of research in the Middle East post 9/11, in Europe, looking at the extremist problems that they've had in some of the countries there. There basically are 4 steps that people go through on an individual level that leads them to extremism. And you may recognize some of this in people that you know who probably fit the definition. That first step is built around psychological distress. And if you think back to the outset of the pandemic, it was scary, right? In many ways, is this going to kill me? Is this going to kill people in my family? Like, how serious is this? Am I going to get COVID? How do I get COVID? Lots of potential for distress around it. And, distress is something that tends to drive change by government in a win-win of democracy. We were like, all right, we're going to bring in the people to address this and come up with the best policy solutions that we can to address what we need. The problem becomes in that sort of second step towards extremism is when you start getting politicians who are pushing cognitively simplistic answers for whatever reasons to alleviate the distress. And sometimes those cognitively simplistic answers are typically about placing blame on other groups, or, to deflect responsibility if they're in office from whatever those distresses are. And people who become susceptible to accepting the cognitively simplistic answers, it becomes incredibly important to them because those cognitively simplistic answers are something that are alleviating or mitigating the distress that they're feeling. And that leads really to the next step, which is what's called the overconfidence effect. And overconfidence is a belief in the rightness of your answers, but the rightness in your answers may not be based on facts. It may be based on cognitively simplistic solutions that you're using, that are being used to cover up the distress that you're feeling, either to deflect it off, responsibility off onto others. And you tend to start to believe that you have a better understanding and ability to assess what answers are real than others. It's kind of, as somebody said to me when I was giving this presentation, a little bit like the idea that all of our kids are, above average, which by definition doesn't fit. That overconfidence effect becomes a real thing. And when people start to succumb to the overconfidence effect, where they believe in their own ability to ascertain answers to big challenges, and certainly a pandemic is something that's big and complicated, it becomes a real problem. And it's at that point that they're really on the fringe of becoming extremists. The next step after that is intolerance. And what really happens with intolerance is when you have something that's alleviating your distress and you've accepted that answer and you believe in your own ability to know what's true, you reach a point where when somebody comes and presents you with a set of facts, um, you think to yourself, I need to enlighten my friend. And we've all had this experience, I think, during the Trump era, where, you know, you try and confront, or certainly during the pandemic, depending on where you were, you try and confront with facts, and you're met with anger. And you're met with anger because they're basically feeling like they need to enlighten you as your friend, and you're rejecting it. But not only are you rejecting it, you're pushing back on the underpinnings of that overconfidence effect. And the natural response is people become angry towards you. And that intolerance is what leads to people seeing the other side as enemies. So when people reach that stage of being psychologically extremist, they're overconfident in the rightness of the answers that they've accepted to answer what's causing them distress, and they're becoming intolerant towards others who don't share those cognitively simplistic answers that are really foundationally important to them in terms of the distress. There's really only two ways that they can go. The first is you can have some kind of event that causes cognitive dissonance, that blows up that cognitively simplistic answer and the distress and how they see themselves. This isn't who I am. And, to me, I use as an example Lindsey Graham. Anybody who saw Lindsey Graham speaking on January 6th at the Capitol after the insurrection, saw somebody who was experiencing cognitive dissonance, who said he was going to leave Trump. The other way that people can go is a continuation towards even more extremism in the form of radicalization and potentially even violence. I must defend my nation. I must defend my values. The other side is enemies, and they're already angry towards them, and they're already believing in the overconfidence, through the overconfidence effect, and the rightness of what they think. And so it creates the potential for people to be radicalized. Now, how does that happen? Well, people move towards radicalization and violence really through three pieces. The first is, a need for personal significance and a desire to matter, to be someone, to fight for the problem. And they do that through a network of like-minded, committed people, finding others, we're the majority. And the more that they find people within that network, they get more of a narrative that they can be, part of a quest greater than themselves, the meaning piece. If you go back and look at some of the interviews after January 6th, there were people saying, coming there was the most meaningful thing that they've done. A lot of this research around the significant quest and the radicalization through need, network, and narrative comes out of post 9/11, and trying to understand what was happening. It was causing, a whole segment, primarily of Muslim men, to become radicalized and, commit acts that certainly were, strapping C4 to themselves and blowing themselves up was not in their self-interest. And it was that cause. Now, as somebody who was involved around the edges and some of that, saw some of that up close, I can tell you, as I sat and watched on 1/6, what troubled me more than anything was what we saw with Donald Trump. And if you think about it, we had need starting on election
This
night.
is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
So on election night, Donald Trump says that. That's followed up by weeks of calling into question the election and calling people to come together to the protests on January 6th. And so, there's the example of that tweet, "Come be a part, patriots, we're going to stand up for our country." And really, the part as I sat and watched what was happening from my apartment in Europe on January 6th, as somebody who'd done all this work around the world, when I saw Donald Trump say this, hold on,
Here, we're going to walk down to the Capitol.
I realized that he was giving them narrative. He was giving them that significant quest. Um, it was very clear where things were headed. Um, and the thing we have to ask ourselves is, has this gotten better or is this getting worse?
This is a
And
fraud. Here, we're going to walk
the
down.
reality is, sorry about that, the reality of it is, um, acceptance of political violence as an acceptable form of political discourse in the United States is rising. Gallup has been asking this question for years, and what we see is starting in November of 2019, first with Democrats, um, and then with Republicans, an increase, and it really increased on the Democrat side during George Floyd. The response to that was Republicans being, all right, we believe, in part because they'd been told that, cognitively simplistic answer, this is what the left is doing. They started to move into that maybe we need violence. And we now have a situation, and this is incredibly troubling because if people have reached the point where they believe violence is an answer, they have become radicalized and potentially violent. We have upwards of 35% of Americans who are now saying that violence may be acceptable in terms of politics. And that is a massive problem. Um, our democracy may not survive that. So the next thing that I want to talk to you a little bit about is something called Lesnaya informaция. And it's a Russian term, and I'm not saying that this is all a great Russian plot of Russians using this against us. What I am saying is it's just a perfect term. It's false information with purpose. Are the Russians doing this in the United States, in Europe? Yeah, they've been doing it since the Cold War, using Lesnaya informacija. But what's different is how much it's being used in our own politics, whether it's in Europe or the United States. Um, False information with a purpose of trying to achieve. And it really is the place where disinformation meets those psychological steps to extremism to achieve a political objective. So what I want to show you next is we have the 4 steps through which people become extremists. And what Lesnaya information tends to do is it starts with planting, and it's planting seeds to amplify grievance through fear. And really that distress that's being planted can be either real or contrived grievances. And then the next step becomes sort of nourishing it. And it's nourished by creating multiple narratives. They may be ridiculous. They may have some true grain of truth in them. It doesn't really matter. During the nourishing process, it's about creating as many narratives as possible, cognitively simplistic solutions that people can attach themselves to. The next step is providing examples conforming to the narratives. So, you try and find, even if it's one example, that people can glam onto and say, yes, this is right. I like to think about the War on Christmas, really. The War on Christmas, to a large degree, was built on a single shopping mall. I believe it was in Missouri someplace, that took down their Christmas tree. But, people who were susceptible to the whole War on Christmas thing glammed onto it, and it became an entire thing. And it was like, well, I know the truth, and the truth is they're attacking my values, and I'm concerned about that. That's my distress. The simplistic answer is the other side is enemies who are attacking it, and I know the truth. The next step is utilizing overconfidence to create division. And that's really about inflaming the intolerance. And that's where Lesnaya informacija starts to bear fruit. And at the point where it's starting to bear fruit, right, you're getting more and more people who they have some examples that they know the facts, that their answers are right, and it's incredibly vested in them because it alleviates the distress that they're feeling. And then the final is, the harvesting, which is where you're leveraging intolerance into specific action, where need, network, and narrative comes in. And if you think about really what went on with the big lie and what led all those Americans who showed up on 1/6 at the Capitol, um, they were really succumbing to a combination of the underlying psychology by which people become extremists and lasagna information to grow them to a place where they could be given need, network, and narrative to go and take a significant quest, which they felt was they were going to overturn the election to save the nation, quite frankly. Um, so as you're watching, and we're going to talk about this in a bit, as you're watching information, always be thinking about how does it fit into the psychology of how people become extremists and how false information with a purpose works to achieve those kinds of autocratic, illiberal ends. And typically what happens is, once you've harvested, then you repeat. And we've seen that to a large degree with some elements of the right in the United States about 1/6, when they start talking about how the people who have been sentenced for the crime of going into the Capitol or beating up police officers are somehow political prisoners. And again, it's plant, nourish, grow with an attempt to bear fruit and harvest. So I want to talk a little bit about the Republican Party and the existential challenges that it faces because of what happened during the Trump era and with Donald Trump still to a large degree at the helm of the Republican Party, but also why, quite frankly, the Republican side and America's, by extension, America's democracy faces a threat. And just because, as I said earlier, one side's illiberalism becomes justification for extremism on the other. And as I showed you in that data, that is happening to some degree. If Republicans are constantly citing Democrats as the enemy, Democrats are ultimately going to start saying Republicans are the enemy. And that is a cycle that will destroy the country. But let's talk about the GOP first a little bit. First thing you have to understand is Trump built an illiberal vertical. And, I saw these around the world. If you were to look at Putin's Russia, it is an illiberal vertical with with Vladimir Putin sitting on the top. All of them are built a little different, but the common thread is they have a leader on the top, they have institutions that they control, they have propaganda, and then there are the other elements of any society, all of which are stacked underneath that top level that's about using fear to enforce their power and rule. And one of the first things that I would always do when I would get asked to go and work in some of these places is I'd try and map out that vertical. And in about 2017, I started thinking about the Republican Party, which I was sort of leaving, and I started mapping out that I thought to myself, the Republican Party's become a classic illiberal vertical. I started to map it out. And, you may end up pausing on here and looking at this some, because every time I do this for this presentation, and I've done it about 300 times, when I do it for Republican groups, everybody's looking to see if they're in there, where would they fall. But, the Republican Party has Donald Trump sitting on the top. He is still on the top. If you look at what's transpired in the primaries of 2022, Donald Trump has gotten far more of his candidates that he's endorsed and supported through than the other side. He still has a band of connected enablers. And one of the tells of a neoliberal vertical is, you have people who are seen as the most important people in the Republican Party whose only real power is derived from their proximity to Donald Trump. When, Trump was in office and Jared Kushner and Ivanka and these people were all seen as some of the most powerful people in the country, perhaps more so than Mitch McConnell, who's an elected minority leader, or Kevin McCarthy. Um, that is a classic tell, no different than some of the oligarchs that are seen as the most important people around Putin. It's about proximity to the leadership is the classic tell of an illiberal vertical. So that illiberal vertical, quite frankly, well, it's probably weaker than it's been. It is still holding in the Republican Party today, and it's not threatened to the degree that it is vulnerable yet. Um, the second thing with the Republican Party as it relates to Trump and Trumpism is that Trump normalized autocratic tactics within the GOP. So when I worked around the world, there's really 6 primary tactics that autocrats use to gain and maintain power. Um, those 6 tactics are: 1, big ideas and big lies. Think build the wall, think Mexico will pay for it. There were numerous ones. There continue to be numerous ones. The second is marginalization. Those who speak the truth within the vertical are pushed out. Liz Cheney would be the probably easiest example of that. The next is dependency. The Republican, the RNC does not want to cut bait on Trump because Donald Trump raises more money than anybody else, or Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz savaged, as did Marco Rubio, as did Lindsey Graham, Donald Trump when they ran against him in 2016. They completely got religion. Why did Ted Cruz go from lying Ted to beautiful Texas Ted? He went from that because he went from questioning Trump to basically kissing Trump's ass. That's dependency. You want power, you want to be in power, you back the leader. The next is disinformation. Disinformation gets misunderstood, particularly in a normal democracy like ours. As I watched the Trump administration unfold, and from day one, when Sean Spicer was talking about crowd size, autocrats use disinformation to see who is willing to repeat it. It's about fidelity to the leader, more than whatever's said, and sometimes they'll want people to repeat the utterly ridiculous, as Spicer was doing, where there was photographic evidence, because they want to make sure that they're willing to prostitute themselves to the illiberal vertical and to the leader. The next one is divide and conquer. And we've seen a lot of divide and conquer, and we're still seeing divide and conquer. It's some of the best is, when Fox News is covering Trump glowingly, he's all about Fox News. When Fox News isn't covering him glowingly, or people like Chris Wallace were calling him out, then he was encouraging people to watch OANN, and Fox News was just part of the media of lies. And that's all about dividing and conquering. And then the last is threats, repression, and violence. And of course, we saw that on 1/6. But the one thing that I've said to a lot of people is, autocrats don't really like killing people. They like people to feel threatened, though, and know that they can be repressed. And in some cases, they like to demonstrate. And, one of the things that's been misread about why Mike Pence was the focus, we tend to focus on that game we know, where Mike Pence, had some constitutional role, but he didn't have the power to overturn the election or send them back to the States. And Donald Trump's basically, through big lies, marginalization and dependency and disinformation, is trying to say that he does. The reason that Mike Pence was the focus of his ire is Mike Pence had been loyal to Donald Trump, probably as much or more so as anyone. And the message that Donald Trump was trying to send with basically his people wanting to hang Mike Pence was, I'm willing to sacrifice anyone to get what I want. And the truth of the matter is had that mob that was in the Capitol gotten their hands on an AOC or a Nancy Pelosi or a Democrat, obviously it wouldn't have ended well. But the dirty secret is, and the reason why Josh Hawley and the 1-6 committee, when they showed the video, was running away, is they would have been willing to hang him as well. It didn't matter. If he was willing to sacrifice Mike Pence, it was to send a message that any of you, if you don't do what I want, will meet Mike Pence's fate. So another issue with the Republican Party has really become that Lesnea Infirmatia has become the dialect in the GOP. And one of the biggest miscalculations that the Republicans made, the non-MAGA Republicans, was this belief right after January 6th, they made a decision somewhere between then and the 10th that if they could replicate Trump's draw amongst rural working class voters without the insanity, they'd have a permanent governing majority. That was a quote from Josh Holmes, who's Mitch McConnell's top political advisor. Just 4 days after the Capitol riots, when they would have certainly been willing to hang Mitch McConnell. I think Donald Trump has made pretty clear and had at that point what he thinks of him. What's ironic is Josh and all of those people, Lindsey Graham going from clear cognitive dissonance back to being with Trump, Kevin McCarthy, what he was saying to his membership versus going to Mar-a-Lago, they were completely misreading the situation. And the irony is that on the 10th, the day that Josh's quote ran in the Post, I want to show you a clip from Sean Hannity talking about McConnell, but I'm going to do so with the psychological factors of how people become extremists and how you target that and what they were doing towards McConnell in trying to make people who watch Sean Hannity's show extremists towards McConnell.
In November, the president won more votes by far than any other Republican in the history of our great republic, nearly 75 million nationwide. Now soon to be Minority Leader Mitch McConnell and a handful of other long-serving establishment Republicans, they are trying to reassert control of the GOP. And their playbook, sadly all too predictable. Instead of picking up the mantle of promoting the president's bold America First agenda, they are tonight cowering in fear, wilting under the pressure from the media mob, liberal Democrats, and big tech companies. Many spineless Republicans are joining forces with their Democratic friends to repudiate all things Trump. In other words, they want to cancel Trump.
Now, this is just one short clip on one night from several years ago, almost over a year and a half ago, of Sean Hannity. But anybody who watches Fox on a regular basis, and I would encourage you actually to watch primetime Fox in the coming days, regardless of what your politics are. But watch it with what you now know about Lesnea Infirmatia and what you now know about the psychology of how people become extremists. And also watch, if you watch Tucker, or you want to subscribe to Fox Nation, some of their shows, how much effort is being put into the next step of significant quest of need, network, and narrative that has the potential to lead people who are already psychologically meeting the definition of extremist to radicalization and potentially violence. One of the things that I went and did as an analysis, and this is Trump's statement that came out post-Senate trial, so it came out on the right around the 10th. And I analyzed about 40 Trump documents, and every time I read them, when he puts stuff out now on Truth Social, I look at it from this dynamic. They all have the same pattern. They start with some cognitive simplicity. They move and flatter the overconfidence effect. They then stoke intolerance and go back to that psychological, whatever the underlying cause of the distress is. Then they move back to, we know the answer, we should be angry about it. And then they almost inevitably go into some sort of significant quest. Somebody asked me, is Donald Trump a genius for doing this? that he's applying these tactics. And I thought, no, I don't think Donald Trump's a genius. But what I do think is, if you listen to conservative talk, if you listen to Fox News, particularly in the prime time, not the news shows, what you see is this being used. And I really think, honestly, it's used not so much out of some grand political conspiracy, but it's probably used because it's a pretty good business model. Once people reach that stage of overconfidence and intolerance and are accepting the answers to alleviate their distress, they're going to tune in for the next outrage, or they're going to tune in for the dopamine hit that comes from, see, we're smart, we're right, we're smarter than those other enemies of ours. And so the outrage and the use of psychology of extremism really is a business model. In Donald Trump's case, he spent so much time watching Fox that he inevitably just naturally parrots it. But the problem is that it really has become the dialect of the Republican Party. Not long after events in April of 2021, there was a huge controversy related to Major League Baseball and the All-Star Game. And it just so happened within 2 days of each other, Rick Scott, Marco Rubio, and Ted Cruz all had op-eds in various newspapers. And something that jumped out at me was the fact that all of them were now parroting. And I don't even know that they knew what they were doing in doing it. And so what you're seeing here is the patterns are a little different, but the plays that they're making and where they're going with them are all using the exact same things. They're using cognitive simplicity geared at the distress. They're stoking overconfidence and intolerance. And in all three cases, they end with a call for a significant quest. And what they're really doing here, probably unintentionally, they're doing it because they know what resonates with the base of the Republican Party, certainly, the ones who are right-wing media dominant. That's why I say it's become the accent and dialect of the Republican Party. And as long as that's happening, it's going to continue to stoke. It's going to continue to stoke towards the potential for somebody to come along and offer need, network, and narrative in a significant quest. And as long as Donald Trump or others, see that as a path to political power, it's a real threat to tear apart the democracy. What I would also say is if we look forward from January 6th, the rhetoric of the right has become its reality in terms of the candidates. And what this shows is some polling. 82% of Fox and 97% of OAN Newsmax viewers believe Trump's election claims, that he stole the election. This is in 2022. Half of Republicans believe that the left led the January 6th riots, according to polling from Ipsos Reuters. What you see on the right is all of the little red dots are candidates who are election deniers, who are flat out saying that Joe Biden lost the election, who've been nominated. A lot of them are going to end up in Congress or potentially as governors or secretaries of state or attorney generals in control of the election mechanism. Our democracy won't stand if that happens, and it's why the 2022 elections are really going to be a tipping point. Because if people like Doug Mastriano, who's a hardcore election denier running for governor of Pennsylvania, win, it becomes really hard to have a presidential election in 2024. And that really gets to the final point I'm going to make before I give you some solutions and things that you can do. And that's what I call the Hodorkovsky line. So the Hodorkovsky line is something that I came up with a long time ago when I was doing work in and around Russia with those fighting for democracy. And the Hodorkovsky line really, when Putin was first elected, there was a lot of hope that he was going to be a democratic reformer. Eventually, Mikhail Hodorkovsky, who's the richest man in Russia, started setting up NGOs. A lot of people thought that he might want to run for president one day. And Putin basically ended up imprisoning him, taking his oil company. And Hodorkovsky spent a massive amount of time in jail. He's since gotten out. But the Hodorkovsky line really was the point where Vladimir Putin couldn't give up power. And what the Hodorkovsky line is really a pretty simple equation when democracy fails. And it's the point where the cost of peacefully conceding power becomes equal to or greater than the consequences of attempting to maintain power and failing. If you're going to go to jail either way, or if you're going to go to jail if you lose power, then there's no reason not to fight to keep it. Because if you fight to keep it and you don't, you're still going to jail. So it becomes a point where people with power can't afford to give up power. They can't afford to have the peaceful transition. And while I don't talk in this presentation about Democrats, one of the things that Democrats, and this is why I worry about January 20th, 2025, if you have an election and you have two sides where, more than half think the other is your enemies, if a Republican wins who Democrats are unsure will give up power, whether that's Donald Trump or somebody else, at the end of 4 years or 8 years, would they be willing to relinquish it, and should they? If you're never getting it back, that's the point where democracy breaks, and that's really the Hodorkovsky rule. So I know I've talked about a lot of things that are, hard. This is the Old Testament part of my presentation. I want to talk to you a little bit about things that you could do, for the lessons really that I learned that are the keys for team democracy to prevail. And the first thing that I want you to understand is the game we're forced to play isn't about policy differences. Policy differences are solved through the win-win of democracy. The game we're in is about power, and will it continue to be wrapped in the win-win of democracy, or is that going to go away and somebody is going to take power and simply hold power? Because, in truth, autocrats really don't care about policy, because at their foundation, they don't really care what people want. They care about their power, them maintaining or gaining power. So policy is just an ends that justifies the means. And so we have to constantly keep in mind that fighting over policy differences, and that doesn't mean that you shouldn't pursue policy agendas within the game that we know and the democracy that we have, but what it does mean is that you have to always be cognizant of how those decisions can impact the potential of illiberal actors taking power. The second thing that's critical for people to understand is you break extremism, the overconfidence and the intolerance, through cognitive dissonance. You find those things that are important, other places potentially where distress rests, or how individuals, and you almost have to do it person by person, sees themselves and lives their life, how it's incongruent with the answers that they're accepting. I can tell you, because I have a lot of friends from back home who are all in on Donald Trump, they're the kind of people you'd want as your neighbors. They're not the kind of people that you'd want to engage in a long conversation that you're going to change their mind about politics. But the way that you can change their minds about politics is to take some of that cognitive dissonance, where how they live their lives and how they are as humans and how they see themselves is incongruent. And when they start to raise it, You have to work with all you can to draw that out and get them to see it. And that gets really to the next point is to change those people's belief. You have to change their behavior through a shift in self-perception. Um, you're never going to shame someone out of their beliefs through facts or who's reached that stage of extremism. All you can hope for is to get them to eventually look back with shame at the beliefs that they held and the actions that they took. And so as you are interacting with family members or friends, don't give up on them. Listen and don't talk at them about your politics or where they may be wrong and very overconfident in the simplistic answers that they're accepting. Don't give them the ability to become intolerant and angry towards you. Rather, move the conversation around, knowing them and knowing who and how they are, and find those places where that cognitive dissonance exists, and then start to help them find where they are incongruent with how they see themselves as a human with those answers that they're taking, that the distress that they're feeling, the answers they're accepting, and that overconfidence that they have is a cognitive dissonance with who they are. And I think you'll find as you do that, you will have some success. I know, and I have an area of expertise in this. I know how hard it is because I have family members who have succumbed to it. But I can tell you, eventually you're going to find things that whether it's Donald Trump or that Republicans are doing, we're seeing a lot of it around Dobbs, right? Don't lecture, draw them out. That is critical. The next thing I want to walk you through is something I call the 7 rules for dealing with autocrats. There's actually 10 of them. I was asked to write material to be used by diplomats and other people from my experiences working in Belarus, Russia, and all those places. There's actually 10 of them. But several years ago, I decided to cut them down and apply them here in the U.S. And so in the U.S., really, there's 7 rules that all of us who are on Team Democracy have to keep in mind all the time. The first one is we have to play the game we're in. When people are playing a zero-sum game, you can't play win-win and zero-sum at the same time. So you have to have a recognition of that. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't work within our democracy. We're still a democracy. We're going to have elections on November 8th. We're going to have elections in 2024. That is not going to change. But we have to recognize there are people playing a zero-sum game, and we have to look for and understand the tipping points where we have to draw the line, and we have to win within our democratic game. We can't afford to lose, and we have to do everything we can within that game we're in. The next is speak truth to power. The January 6th committee has done a tremendous job. People in the media have attempted over and over again, defining stories about where you're speaking truth to power. You have to think about where are there opportunities for you to speak truth to power. Maybe it's writing a letter to the editor. Each of us has to look at what can we bring to this fight that's unique. All of us have something unique that we can bring. And for each of us, it's going to be different. Think about, are there opportunities for you to speak truth to power? And power in this case, quite frankly, is working to convince others that win-win democracy and what's happened that is far superior to the alternative, and focusing on why that's the case. So speaking truths is critical. The next is don't arm the autocrats. One of the things that it happens all over the world with those who are fighting on the side of democracy. They tend to want to focus on the game they know. And oftentimes, we can have a legitimate conversation today in America about policing. And there are people who probably believe pretty passionately about, moderating what the police do. And quite frankly, I'm one of the people that believes that we should address policing, particularly as it relates to African Americans. But when you have people who are pushing disband the police, that is extremism. That's overconfidence and, quite frankly, intolerance, and probably even borderline radical. That is battering rams. They will use that with Lesnea information as the one example. And if you watch a little bit of Fox or you listen to Donald Trump and his vilification of people, he picks people to make as the example that gets applied to everybody. Don't arm the other side. It's critically important. Next, the past and the future are illiberal kryptonite. Every autocrat I've ever encountered, and their enablers and their appeasers, they want to live in the present because they can say anything in the present and try and get away with it because of overconfidence and intolerance. They're gonna do that. The more you can force them to answer for the past or project into the future, the bigger their problems are going to be. And I have this picture here of Mike Pence standing there, who Donald Trump wanted to hang in his tweet. The more that stuff like that is talked about, and the uncertainty, if you're Donald Trump, about what is Mike Pence going to do? Is he going to go talk to the 1-6 committee? Is he talking to the 1-6 committee? Who's he talking to? I tried to hang him. I encourage a mob to hang him. That forces past and uncertainty of the future. If you let them stay in the present, they will always beat you. But if you can force them to be talking about the past, or you can push them into the future, you put them on defense. The next is practice zero-sum judo. Adam Kinzinger, Liz Cheney, are examples of people who are practicing it every day. Nancy Pelosi, by putting Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney on the 1-6 committee, was practicing zero-sum judo. Take their marginalization, take their dependency, take those tactics they use and flip them. Judo is taking their strengths and throwing them against them. We have to do that each day. Whether you're on the local level or the national level, or you're just somebody who cares, if you see an opportunity to flip, use it. You look at those rules that they use, and if you can find ways to flip, if you can find ways to divide them. President Biden did that with his speech the other night, in which he talked about MAGA Republicans versus regular Republicans. Zero-sum judo is a powerful tool. Next, Stalin rule. Stalin rule is pretty simple. Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, two of the greatest, leaders in history, quite frankly, committed Democrats, stood with Joseph Stalin, probably the second worst human being to ever traverse the planet. But they needed to prevail to defeat the worst human being, Adolf Hitler, who crossed the planet. And so in the Stalin rule is pretty simple. You make common cause with anybody else who stands for democracy, regardless of what policy differences you have. I don't agree with Nancy Pelosi on probably more than 10% of policy choices. But I think Nancy Pelosi is one of the greatest Americans in terms of standing and fighting for democracy and applying these rules. That's the Stalin rule. You can live to fight another day on the policy differences once democracy has been secured. The final rule is confront, expose, and destabilize the vertical every chance you get. And the vertical can be anyone from people who are, supportive extremists on either side, confronting them, exposing them, destabilizing them, using cognitive dissonance to try and get them to see the truth. People in the media, obviously, they're doing that every day. But each of us has to wake up every day and think, what can I do to confront, expose, and destabilize the illiberal verticals? The last thing that I want to give you in closing. Um, all of us have to realize and recognize and try and impact the tipping points. There's going to be tipping points that we don't know that happen between now and 2024. There's tipping points we do know. You know, the Dobbs decision was a tipping point. It's energized a lot of Americans. It's called into question um, amongst a lot of Republicans, Democrats too. Russia invading Ukraine. You know, I have a good friend um, who left Trump world when Donald Trump said that Vladimir Putin was a genius, and Vladimir Putin was saying that he was thinking about nuking all of us. Um, we need to recognize, you know, that there are going to be tipping points, and those tipping points we have to impact them. We're not going to know them all. You know, no one could have expected George Floyd to happen and ignite what it did and what repercussions it had for the election. No one expected COVID and the impact that that had. But ultimately, what we also have to keep in mind is if you impact the tipping points, it's really about winning at the moment of critical mass. And everything that we do and everything that you do in terms of democracy from this point forward needs to be focused on how do we as Americans ensure that on January 20th, 2025, we have had an election and we can have a peaceful transition of power to someone who is going to honor the win-win proposition bestowed to us by our founding fathers. So that's Faith or Fear. It ran a little longer than I wanted. I have my contact information where you can follow me on Twitter and you can direct message me. If you have further thoughts or you want to talk about this or you know audiences that would benefit from this. So I want to thank you for your time. And I really appreciate it. And we're going to win. We have to win. We really don't have any other choice for ourselves, for our children. We don't want to be the generation of Americans who let democracy's flame die.